Hello there, greetings of the season and welcome to a bumper edition of the front page. I say bumper because there is so much to talk about. No need for top of the show paraphernalia from me this week because we have got affordability checks, Frankie Dettori and the whip. Three huge subjects, which means there's lots for you to engage with. If you're watching on YouTube, please do like, comment, subscribe and share. Tell us what you think. And these two guys are going to tell you what they think as well. I'm joined this week by Racing Post editor Tom Kerr and our West Country guru and much else besides, James Stevens. Guys, what a weekend.
Unbelievable. Never has so little racing given us so much to talk about. It's just astonishing. We had Dettori retiring, a huge story, and then 24 hours later Davy Russell going as well. We've had all the whip drama. My God, it's been some week for the news given we've only had about 2 meetings. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, James, the weather actually in some ways helped because without all the abandonments, we'd have had no room to get everything in the paper.
No, that's true. I mean, it's been a funny old week. You've sort of been scratching your head looking at the BHA admin site, trying to work out what's going to be on, what's going to be off, and then, as you say, these sort of bombshells come. But yeah, it's just a sport, isn't it? We're just around the corner from Christmas, and we've had all sorts of surprises. But look, hopefully the attention will turn to the racing because we've got some great racing with Christmas, but some massive stories, as you say. Yeah, there is a fantastic racing programme to look forward to over Christmas, and let's hope that is unimpacted by the weather. Seems good so far. What might well be impacted, however, is your punting because of affordability checks. Tom, it's your story and lots of coverage in the Racing Post over recent days.
Yeah, we had a 3-part special report on affordability checks. These have obviously been in the news agenda for quite some time, but we thought it was a good time to do a deep dive into what they are and how they're affecting people and how they're affecting racing. So, you know, to very quickly recap for those who might still be unaware what affordability checks are, they're basically the idea that anyone who gambles at a certain level should have to prove that they can afford to gamble at that level. These are obviously enormously controversial because there's no other form of discretionary spending at which people are asked to supply financial documentation like pay slips and tax returns in order to demonstrate that they can afford. So you and I can go and lose millions if we had it on the stock market playing options or buying cryptocurrency, but if you have £100 singles on horse racing, it's very likely that at some point you're going to get hit by affordability checks. So we spoke to, first of all, a lot of punters. We put out a call to our readers saying, get in touch with us if you've been affected, and we got dozens and dozens of responses, and then followed up with interviews with many of them. Basically, what came through very strongly was a couple of things. First of all, that more and more bettors are getting swept up in these, albeit generally speaking, the people who are getting swept up are those who are betting at a fairly high level, £100 singles, like I say, and upwards. The most of the people who are getting caught up basically are declining to hand over their documentation because it's not something they want to share with a bookmaker. But some of those who are handing it over are actually finding they're being turned down anyways because they're asset rich, not income rich, for example. Or they earn their money doing something like trading stocks, which is irregular. Some of them are then turning to the black market. We had one, we had several who were saying they've looked into the black market, but one in particular was absolutely fascinating because they were talking about betting through WhatsApp, and indeed even having someone who kind of like the Deliveroo of betting would take a bet on WhatsApp and then deliver the winnings to you in cash. So, you know, a real interesting insight into the black market. The final piece of the series looked at the impact on racing, and this was the most eye-opening element of it because ARC Chief Executive Martin Cruddas basically opened the books and he said in the last 2 quarters of 2022, turnover on ARC tracks was down 23%. And he said if you sort of map that across the industry, it represents an 800 million turnover decline on racing. So that's obviously a huge impact. We've seen also at the Racing Post, we've seen sort of documentation from other bookmakers that supports that level of decline. So it's very clear that what we're seeing from affordability is a very pronounced impact on both bettors and racing. And that's going to have pretty calamitous repercussions if it goes on.
And that £800 million impact on turnover, Martin's figure suggested that if you convert that to what it actually means to racing's income, what's coming into the sport, £40 million, which is colossal.
He suggested it's £40 million. We obviously don't have access to understand what the direct implication on racing is, because it's obviously a complex funding model with media rights, the levy, sponsorship and more. But clearly it is having a big impact on racing, and if it is having an impact of that region, £40 million for example, that's going to have a direct knock-on to everything racing spends its money on, whether it's prize money most obviously, but also things like capital investment in race courses, marketing campaigns, all the things that we want to do when we talk about trying to sell racing in 2023, when we talk about racing trying to draw more people back to the tracks. Well, if you have less money coming into your coffers, it means your ability to do any of these things is basically diminished. So the repercussions for racing are already serious, and the concern is they're going to get much worse because affordability checks will sweep up more and more people over the coming months.
And I suppose the problem, well, there's a huge number of problems with it, James, but as Tom talked about, £40 million and the hit to racing's income, it doesn't happen at a time when racing is exactly swimming with money. In Britain, the situation is already difficult as it is. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, Tom's touched on there, that 40 million, but we're looking at this early stage. It's only going to get worse. That amount is going to be bigger, especially if this comes in and the intensity, it could happen. It could get much bigger. So I think that's one good point. I think the other thing as well to sort of keep in mind is, as you say, the sport needs that sort of money to develop and grow further, because I think that the thing about the affordability and on top of the situation with racing is I think it will turn people off betting, which I think is problematic for racing, because for a lot of people that's their avenue into the sport.
Yeah.
That's their way of for most people probably, and that's their way of getting an interest. And there'll be a lot of people that may not build up an association with the sport because they feel that they don't want to be restricted. They don't want any sort of impact on how they're judged on their money and things. It's quite intrusive. That's the word we've been using about it. And I think that people won't want to just give away their information as such. That sort of link to the sport is going to be closed. So not only are we having less money to market it, a really good way of getting into the sport is also going to be closed off as well. So it's massively worrying.
Yeah. I saw Joe Saumarez-Smith last week for an interview that will run in Friday's print edition and Thursday digitally. And obviously we spoke about affordability checks there and his role as BHA chair. And among the points he was making was that whilst they believe that they have managed to persuade government on a number of fronts, things like the fact that a ban on bookmaker advertising in horse racing would be devastating to the sport, they are still seriously concerned about affordability checks on a number of different levels. One being that whilst there are suggestions from within government that what they prefer are unobtrusive checks whereby punters wouldn't actually physically have to say, here's my tax return, here's my bank statement, that those sort of unobtrusive checks might not be technically possible anyway, that the technology might not be there to make that happen, and therefore punters would have to present that sort of data. But also, they're concerned even at this point, at a time when we think we're probably just weeks away from publication of the white paper, that there might be surprises still in there, and that they're just not completely sure that what they think will be in that white paper will be in that white paper. So there's genuine concern from the BHA chair, and I still wonder whether all elements across racing have quite got how serious this is. It's clear that racecourses understand and the BHA understands, but I wonder whether participants as yet are completely understanding that this is a huge bombshell that's waiting.
Yeah, I don't think that it has sunk in yet, or even close to it, because it is a huge unfolding disaster for the sport, basically. If we've already got to the stage that £800 million has been taken out of turnover, and the white paper's not come, and affordability checks have only been in existence for 12 months, then you have to assume that situation's got the potential and is likely to get much worse. One of the things that came through in all the reader interviews that we did was this idea that people who used to have 3 accounts now have 1 left.
Yeah.
Or they have 5 accounts and now they've got 2 left, because they're getting hit one by affordability checks, and they are just stopping. So when they get their final account hit by affordability checks, what happens? They just stop. And at that point, another person's income to sport, another person's contribution to the sport, another person's interest in the sport is basically finished. So 800 million so far could easily become much bigger. Now, the number which was sort of cited when affordability checks were first mooted was 60 to 100 million pounds a year hit to racing's bottom line. Considering we're also seeing attendance that's falling, considering that there seems to be very little probability right now that the levy reform which the sport has sought is going to happen, you're basically looking at racing's funding being hit on every side. And I completely agree with you. I think very few people within the sport truly grasp what a detrimental thing this for the sport is going to be, if not catastrophic, because it will impact prize money, it will impact the competitiveness of the sport, and it will impact the sport's ability to invest for the future. And
just one last one on this one, guys. Bear in mind, you're both punters. You're used to making forecasts on things. What would your forecast be for what's going to happen over the coming year, in the sense that if we get the white paper early in January, at that point the politics starts, at that point the lobbying becomes more intense. There's a danger that the government might want to almost pass the buck to the Gambling Commission, which is really where this problem has started with in the first place, because the Gambling Commission has been acting of its own volition on this, setting its own policies. Are you hopeful that the government will understand the potential damage to horse racing and put in more controls over the Gambling Commission, or make a white paper that is able to tackle problem gambling but doesn't go so far as to damage, create unintentional damage? Or do you fear that we are now on a course that is heading towards this existential threat to racing that you've spoken about before?
So I think, from what I've heard about what's in the white paper, and you're right, there's still some uncertainties, it's quite clear that the government is much less inclined to go down this route of intrusive affordability checks than the Gambling Commission is. The government, I think instinctively is wary of a government-mandated financial check in order for people to spend their own money.
Particularly Conservative government.
Particularly Conservative government, which is basically about empowering people to make their own choices, self-responsibility. The problem is the horse is bolted. The Gambling Commission has already effectively mandated these checks in a widespread fashion. So unless the government comes out and says, right, this is what we say on affordability checks, they are not to be intrusive, and we're going to rein in the Gambling Commission, then nothing will change. If they kick it down the road and they basically give responsibility to the Gambling Commission, nothing will change. So that is what's likely to happen after the white paper comes out. If the white paper is much more sensible and moderate on affordability checks, the Gambling Commission needs to be brought into line effectively, because it's basically a government quango which is accountable to almost nobody, has decided that for the first time in British history, you need to submit financial documentation in order to spend your own money. So that's the bottom line of it, basically. And if racing wants to reverse some of the damage that's been done by affordability checks, it's going to have to campaign like it has never campaigned before to government, to say, our sport is being strangled, it's being throttled by a regulator gone rogue, and you need to rein them in. Will that happen? We'll see.
We'll see. There's no doubt that is going to be one of the biggest narratives that goes through what we report on in 2023. Another one is going to be our second story, Frankie Dettori, who announced on Saturday that he will retire at some point in 2023, guys. We think his projection is California and the Breeders' Cup, which is very frank. He was never going to retire at Thirsk on a Monday. It was always more likely to be a glamorous venue with decent weather. So Santa Anita is where it's going to end. Santa Anita is where this farewell tour is going to start as well, on Boxing Day there. So he made the announcement on ITV on Saturday. We'd worked with him as well during the week, so I spoke to him on Tuesday for an interview that we ran again alongside the ITV piece, in which he explained his reasoning for deciding that the time has come. And he was pretty honest in saying that age has been a big factor. He turned 52 on Thursday. And he made the very fair point that means he'll be 53 next year, and he just wonders whether at 53 he really should be doing this. He believes he's still riding at the full height of his powers, and he wants to finish like that. He said he doesn't want to be someone who sits in the corner of the weighing room on the big days, unable to get right. He wants to end at the top. John Gosden, his principal trainer, has said the same when we spoke to him on Saturday. He feels it's very important that Frankie ends in that way. So what we've got to look forward to now is a farewell tour. You know, Elton John's planning his. Now Frankie Dettori has got his to look forward to as well. And Frankie being Frankie, it will be big. You know, so starting in California, there'll be Middle Eastern stopovers as well. There'll be plenty of big days in Europe. Wouldn't at all surprise me if he tries to pop into Australia in their autumn or spring, going towards Champions Day and then the Breeders' Cup. He wants it to be a celebration, and I think it's key that racing really maximises this. It's impossible to overstate, I think, the extent to which Frankie Dettori transcends the sport in terms of participants. All throughout his career, and it's a marathon career. You know, it started riding back in the late 1980s. Astonishing, really. All throughout his career, he has been an enormously popular figure. Events have made him bigger and bigger and bigger. Hard to believe, really, with a racing participant, that you can have someone who hosted Top of the Pops, who regularly appeared on Michael Parkinson's chat show, who had his own range of restaurants, of frozen pizzas, who had a cookbook, Frankie's Italian cookbook. I'm sure you both use it regularly. No other racing figure could be that big. And we're going to lose him at some point next year, and I think it's vital that the sport really maximises, capitalises on what could be a priceless opportunity for horse racing. Sure, not every day is going to be a big day, but whenever Frankie's going somewhere for the final time, you'd imagine there's going to be enhanced, heightened media interest, both from national media organisations and local media organisations. Great chance for racing to sell itself with a positive story, someone who's really popular with the public. And my fear would just be that although the desire and the enthusiasm will be there from the sport to do that, we know from what we've spoken about in the past that racing's marketing budget isn't as big as it should be. You look at what France Gallo do every year around the Arc de Triomphe and the Grand Steeplechase de Paris. We could only dream of doing that sort of thing. And I just hope that the sport is really able, as I say, to make the most of this, because it seems to me to be an enormously valuable opportunity. Lots of other great jockeys. David Russell retired over the weekend, and it's no disrespect to him or anybody else to say that nobody's retirement would be anywhere near as big as this. So I just hope that racing can make the most of it. James, what about you? Are we overstating how big a deal this could be? Are you actually, with your mates, were they not really bothered about Frankie Dettori?
No, I think, as you've rightly said, Frankie is doing a very Frankie thing by having a whole year to sort of go off and celebrate. But that's what he is. You know, he's a huge character, and I think you've mentioned sort of how he's been around for a long time, such a big figure. He's very likeable. He's a sporting star that people genuinely like, and that's been the case for a long, long time. He's had his up and downs. He's had an incredible comeback. He's been at the top. He's done a bit of everything. Every good sporting story, he's sort of all rolled into one. So I think it's fantastic. We're going to have a year of it, and I think it's going to go around the world, highlight what we can do. And for this country, and we touched on sort of attendances, you'd hope that maybe the big Royal Ascots will always have a big crowd, but days like sort of a Leicester or a Yarmouth or Nottingham and stuff, that they'll give a bit of local coverage to it, and it can really boost the sport. You know, racing can't expect the coverage it possibly once had anymore. You know, there's so much competition. Football has just grown into the big sporting beast, and I think someone like Frankie, a name that people know, you just call him Frankie, don't you? And you know who you mean. It's very difficult to have people like that, so celebrating him is great. I mean, I spoke to Ascot yesterday, who said sort of Champions Day, albeit it's the season finale, the big day, they're going to centre it around Frankie. They're going to use that as a platform to really grow the day, and you know, they could possibly have a record crowd there, you know, because people will want to come and see and send him off. I think it's going to be an incredible sort of year to follow him, see him sort of in the spotlight, and I think from a racing perspective, he's going to be massively missed because he's such a huge figure, especially at Ascot more than anywhere, I suppose. But having a jockey that everyone knows, that everyone can associate with, that people like, it's going to be very hard to replace him, and I don't think there's an obvious candidate who is the next Frankie Dettori. There probably will never be another Frankie Dettori.
No. Actually, on that point, Tom, I started the column today with a question. This race has had a long-held lament. What happens after Frankie? Does that concern you?
I think it will concern everyone in the sport, to be honest, because so much about attracting certainly casual viewers to a sport is about this dreaded word, the narrative. And you look at the World Cup that's just been, and we just had an unbelievable World Cup final, and the build up to that World Cup final was very much centred around two individuals. Messi on the Argentinian side, arguably the greatest of all time, put his last World Cup finals. This is his chance to cap his career in the most spectacular fashion, versus Mbappe, the talismanic star of the French squad, representing the next generation. And, you saw that repeated throughout the World Cup, whether it's Ronaldo or Harry Kane or Jude Bellingham. These sort of stars come through and become the talking points of it. Racing is not wealthy in that respect.
No.
We don't have a lot of people that resonate beyond the sport, and Frankie's probably the last of them, certainly in the riding ranks, who's not retired. So it is a concern, because we need to create more stars, because those are the stories that ultimately connect with people who don't really know that much about the sport and give them a way into it. I mean, you were talking earlier, James, about talking to the sports promoting genius that is Barry Hearn, who was saying pretty much this exact point.
Yeah, he said, I mean, it didn't make the main copy because he made so many good points, but he said sports need more heroes, and that racing, you go down the high street and people know who Frankie Dettori is, but they may not know any other jockeys, and sport does need heroes. It's the hook, isn't it, to sort of get that media coverage more than anything. Yeah,
and Davy Russell, leaving the jumps ranks, he's not on the same level as a Dettori, but he kind of represents the last of a sort of an old school generation in the jumps ranks that also included Richard Johnson, Barry Geraghty, but perhaps most importantly of all, Ruby Walsh and A.P. McCoy. And in the jumps as well, not to denigrate in any way the current ranks of stars, but we've not really necessarily seen a wealth of people coming through to sort of replace them. The possible exception there is Rachel Blackmore, whose achievements have definitely propelled her to status outside the sport.
Yeah.
And Bryony Frost as well, who sort of sells the sport so well and has a very sort of idiosyncratic and unique style of communicating that the public have really taken to their hearts. So it's not that there's no bright spots, that there's no stars coming through. There are, and racing is blessed to have some really fascinating people in its ranks. But I think it would be fair to say that no one for a long time has crossed over in the way Dettori has. And it's hard to see anyone coming through now who has the potential to do likewise. But of course, we don't know. It could be this time next year we're heralding the next charismatic superstar of the sport, but let's hope so, because racing will need that.
Yeah, it will. And the final year actually could be a pretty prolific year for Frankie too. He's got 2,000 Guineas Open Cheldean, 1,000 Guineas Open commissioning. Yeah. He mentioned a horse trained by John Thady Gosden, Epictetus, who ran second in the
Here's a question. If he gets a brilliant star, if he wins the Classics, does he retire? Or does he say at the end of it, one more year, triumphant, leading the crowd at Santa Anita in one more year?
I don't know. Maybe I'm being overly cynical, but as well as being a great and enthusiastic jockey, Frankie's quite a commercial beast, and he will know that there could be good commercial reasons behind a farewell tour. It will. Again, get him in the public glare all around the world, and it will be pretty useful, I think, to him when he goes forward, because you'd imagine that his team, Peter Burrell, his manager, he's very good at getting Frankie out there, and I'm pretty sure that all around the world they will want to use, they will want Frankie in the media glare from 2024 onwards.
Do you think he'll be in racing media, or do you see a more general media future?
I think they'll be keen for him to do some work for ITV. I think he's already done work with ITV, and I think he'll do more work with ITV, but I think they will see him as a bigger deal than horse racing. The people have joked about how he's certain to be in sequence in 2024. But he's big enough.
Strictly Come Dancing, for anyone.
Yeah, but he's a big enough figure that you wouldn't necessarily say he'd be doing Strictly Come Dancing. He could be doing Dancing with the Stars in America.
That's the
American version, because again, he's a global figure.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite important for him this year, to get around the world again, to fireworks Frankie's final days. I remember the last Breeders' Cup I did. I was going around the shopping mall that is next to San Antonio Racecourse. And because, racing time, they were trying to sell the racing. And you had great big cardboard cutouts of Frankie Dettori from the ceiling. Not Mike Smith or any of the big American jockeys, Frankie Dettori. Because I think globally, Frankie Dettori is the human representation of not just his profession, but also his sport. And I think they'll want to really hammer home that global aspect to Frankie Dettori. But ultimately, more than anything, it's a great chance for British racing as well to really get some, last bit of juice out of Frankie Dettori as a jockey before he goes off and does lots of exciting new things, which we will no doubt be reporting on from 2024 onwards. Sequins almost certainly part of that. We'll hope that Frankie Dettori doesn't fall foul of the authorities in his final year, but he'll have to make sure he rides to new whip rules. Or will he, James? Because the new whip rules were again cast into some doubt last week.
Yeah, so just to possibly go back to the start. So in the summer we had a major whip review looking back about how it's used and such, and there's some key points made there. For example, that severe sort of breaches of the rules would end in disqualification, a huge implications that, but also the use of a whip in a backhand position is a particularly sort of interesting element of that. And we knew it was sort of coming in the autumn, and they announced that the more sort of timeline was coming in the autumn, and they've announced that it would sort of start in January for the jumps and with a soft launch, and then a bit later in the flat. But the idea of a backhand position is something the jockeys haven't been happy about. I did a very moderate meeting at Taunton. I've decided to ask a few jockeys how the backhand position was going, and some very passionate answers back. Harry Cobden slammed the BHA, to be honest. He sort of said they hadn't even considered them. It was really outpouring emotion. And Sean Bowen got a really, really interesting sort of line about how he's tried to embrace the new backhand position, but he's one of the smaller sort of jockeys. And as such, he finds it difficult to really hit the horse in the right place in the hind quarters. Yeah. So he struggled with that. And that's a really sort of key practical element of it that's come into fruition and that's been highlighted. So there's been quite a few jockeys complaining and stressing some points. And the BHA have come back and said they're going to sort of reopen the discussions regarding the whip rules that they announced in the summer, with this probably backhand position one of the key elements of it. I think that's a little bit disappointing that we've sort of come to this situation, that we've gone away through the summer, we've made the decision, and now we've come to the point where actually we've tried it and we need to sit down. That seems to me a bit of a bad look for racing, to be honest with you, to come so close to when we're going to implement it and now we're sort of backtracking a little bit. I think that's a major disappointment, to be honest with you. But yeah, this is something we have to get right. People have mentioned the timeline, and we're building up to Cheltenham and the rules are going to come in, and people speculating that there can be all sorts of bans and jockeys missing Cheltenham and it's going to be sort of chaos. I think there's more important things than one Cheltenham Festival. The whip is a huge topic in horse racing. For many people who may know Frankie Dettori and little else, they will know about the whip in horse racing, will have some sort of feeling about it. And ensuring that is right from a sort of public perception point is absolutely massive for racing. So it's important we get this right. We learn how to use it, correctly, how it looks correctly, and so that it can be used in a way that makes the sport as good as possible, but also from a viewer is as comfortable viewing as possible.
Yes, completely agree with all that. Tom, when I heard this news, and particularly the parts that James was referencing there about how some jockeys have raised practical problems with the backhand only rule. On one hand, I thought, okay, well, yeah, it's good that if there are practical problems to actually living within the new rules, it's good that they're raised by jockeys, and it does sound like there might well be a practical reason why this might not work as they want it to work. However, I also found it really frustrating because this was all made public in July. You had jockeys that were central to the process, two of the weighing room's most intelligent and respected individuals, Tom Scudamore and PJ McDonald, were part of this whip review. They both spoke eloquently when the rules came out, explaining why they believed they were good for the sport. The Professional Jockeys Association, again, backed the review and described a robust process that have got us to this point, and yet now, 5 months down the line, we're in this point where the jockeys and the BHA are again having to discuss what rules should be put in place early next year. And it seems to me it's a wider example of one of the issues that racing faces, regardless of the governance structure that is in place at the time, is that yes, you have situations, many situations, whereby the two key stakeholder polar groups, if you like, participants and racecourses don't agree. But you also have situations where within a participant group, they don't agree. On this occasion, jockeys are not in agreement about what to do now. There's been talk of strikes, which would suggest there is unity in one sense, but equally, you've got jockeys on the whip review group, the PJ saying it's a great idea, and then you've got Harry Cobden saying the whole review is bloody ridiculous.
And that they've not been consulted? Or
yeah, absolutely.
Not been
When clearly, as a group, they have been consulted.
It's kind of depressing and a massive sense of deja vu about this, because we've totally been here before. But the worst thing about it is when the whip review recommendations came out, you thought, well, this is a different way of doing it. They've gone and they've consulted widely. They've put together this august body of the great and good from across the sport, and they've done a lot of research, and then they've come up with some recommendations which, you know, are the product of this group's collated wisdom and their research. And you thought, well, come on, what could be a problem with that? And now here we are 5 months down the line talking about jockey strikes. You know, and you can imagine how that would play if it ever came to pass. You know, the headlines are completely abysmal in that respect. So it's really depressing that this has happened, and I think we have to take on good faith that everyone who was in the steering group did a thorough job and executed their responsibilities to the best of their ability. But if we're now hearing that one of the problems is that some jockeys are too short to use the backhand strike safely, then that feels like a bit of an oversight. And the other thing which everyone is I think sensibly raising as a problem is the question of timing. You know, they're saying you bring this in at the beginning of the season, bring it in May for the jump jockeys, so that it's not something which is going to be a big deal heading into the Cheltenham Festival. And some people have raised the example, you know, you don't change the rules a week before the FA Cup final, for example, football. It just feels like this was a sort of self-inflicted wound that could have been avoided. Although I suppose on the other hand, it's just another illustration of the degree to which the whip is the sort of Gordian knot of racing problems that keeps on causing issues, no matter how sensibly you think your approach to dealing with it might be.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I would say as well that a lot of people use the whip as a stick to beat the BHA and say that what's happened? Why is British Racing's governing body so bothered about this? We shouldn't pretend that this is just happening in Britain. You know, the same debate is happening in most major racing jurisdictions.
And the BHA, you know, deliberately decided that they would not adjudicate on this issue, that they would get a group of external experts from across the sport to put forward recommendations, which the BHA board then basically accepted. So, you know, the BHA gets a kicking, and sometimes the BHA deserves a kicking, but in this case it's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't, really, because they ultimately outsourced this to a group of people, and I don't think anyone criticising the whip rules would look at that group of people, which includes some of the most august names in the sport, and say, well, they don't know what they're doing.
No, exactly. Yeah, no, I think sympathy for those involved trying to sort this out at the moment, but it's key that it does get sorted out early in the new year. So 3 big stories for us to deliberate on here, and as ever it is the host's role to determine which story will be made the front page story of the week. When Chris Cook is in one of these chairs, he always complains that the host picks his own story, and he particularly says that to me when I'm in. Maybe you're a different sort of host.
No, I mean I do the same shamelessly.
Okay, good. Right, okay, good. So, but I don't know. Naturally, I want to say that Frankie Dettori is the biggest story, and I think he is undoubtedly the biggest name. But I'm going to be generous and say that because Frankie's riding throughout 2023, there'll be umpteen occasions for us to say that Frankie Dettori is the front page story of the week, particularly if he goes and wins the Derby when he gets to California in November. So I'm not going to say I am the holder of the front page story this week, and James's story again for similar reasons. James, Whip is obviously massive story, but we don't quite know how this is going to play out yet. We should hopefully know more early in the new year, if not before. So again, plenty of occasions for us to debate that one. Plenty of occasions too for us to debate affordability checks as we go forward. But it does feel as if it's such a critical story for not just the betting industry, but for horse racing going forward. And as we are on the cusp of this gambling review white paper, we hope now we're on the cusp of it. I think that probably should be the front page story of the week. So congratulations to the editor of the Racing Post, Tom Kerr, who has this week's front page story. That then is pretty much it from us this week. However, I should just say that although there won't be much racing taking place over Christmas, that's no excuse not to use Racing Post products. We're publishing loads of great content, and download our new app. It has exclusive content from the biggest names like Tom and James and our top tipping team, free daily tips from people like Paul Keeley and Tom Siegel and Keith Melrose and many others. Do stay tuned to the Racing Post on all our platforms. Thank you to Tom, thank you to James. I'll let you know now that we will have an end of year special to disturb your mince pie consumption before the start of the new year. And aside from that, all it leaves me to say now is happy Christmas, have a great time, and we will see you very soon. Bye-bye.